Mm, My name's Mandy Haggis. I'm the coordinator of the European Environmental Paper Network. And with us we've got Michael Sturgis, who's from Inventia, a pulp and paper, an expert on the environmental footprint of pulp and paper, and also Meredith Walsh, who works for the Penguin Group and has been looking in particular at the environmental footprint of paper versus digital books. We're hoping that this talk will help to raise some of the interesting issues around the debate between the environmental footprint of paper and the environmental footprint of digital alternatives. We're hoping this will help to inspire you to think about how you, in your own workplaces, you might be able to look at what the effects of shifting from paper to digital might be. So we're hoping that this talk will raise some of the questions that need to be asked and also look at some of the approaches that have been taken by individuals and organizations who've looked into this, and hopefully inspire a few bits of discussion and question and answer at the end. So I'll briefly explain who I am and what the project is about. The European Environmental Paper Network is a coalition of about 70 non-governmental environmental and human rights organizations, so spread all across Europe and beyond. And the thing we all have in common is a vision for the future of our society's manufacture and use of pulp and paper. We have a sister network in North America, and altogether well over 100 organizations share the same vision. And our vision has 5 goals. We want to see in the rich countries of Europe and North America, who currently consume vastly much more than any kind of fair share of our global paper resources, we want to see that consumption reducing, focusing on the really high utility papers and getting rid of the low utility paper applications. And those of you who were in the previous webinar will find out exactly what we mean, will know exactly what we mean by low and high paper utility. And if not, you can see that webinar and other related resources on our website. We also want to see a reduced reliance on virgin forest fibers, increased social responsibility and responsibility in sourcing fibers from forests, and clean production methods in paper use. But it's the first of these 5 goals that's the focus of our current project, where we're looking at paper efficiency measures that can be taken in our society, across our society, to reduce the amount of paper that we're using. And why? Basically because we want to protect this forests like this one in Canada, avoiding their wholesale destruction in order to make paper, and to minimize the amount of paper that's just been tossed aside without really having performed any useful functions. So the reason we're concerned to see paper being used more efficiently is because it has a huge breadth of impacts, both environmental and social. And those impacts include a very substantial climate change emissions. So the carbon footprint of paper is big, and as calculations and understanding of that improve, it seems that our estimates of how big that footprint is are growing. And if you're interested in that particular topic, we're running a seminar in July, on the 9th of July in London, in person, where we'll have some of the world's experts on carbon footprinting of paper. Other big impacts of paper making are forest destruction, huge use of energy and water to produce it, the production of waste and pollution, development of unsustainable plantations in some parts of the world, and social problems, including illegal logging and the abuses of human rights and land rights, and so on. So the Shrink project, the current paper efficiency project that this webinar is part of, is focusing on the UK and looking at how we can take action on paper efficiency. We're looking at a broad spectrum of different sorts of organisations, and the assessment that we're currently doing of how they're all doing on paper efficiency is going to be published in July of this year. We have a relatively new website and we're putting new information up on it all the time. There's another of these pep talks happening 4 weeks from now about packaging, and as I mentioned, our climate change paper vapor seminar in London in July. This particular pep talk is going to look at whether digital applications are a good alternative to some uses of paper, and how we try to work that out, how we try to compare the environmental impact of paper versus digital. At a very simple level, looking globally, the paper industry accounts for around about 8% of global climate change emissions. The IT industry, on the other hand, accounts for about 2.7% of global emissions. The climate group in a study estimated that about 25% of current paper consumption could be replaced with digital applications. And if these, just taking a very superficial comparison of these two figures, if that could bring down the global emissions from the paper industry, that perhaps is a good thing. So there are some huge questions that this webinar can only scrape the surface of about how we compare paper versus digital. First of all, should we be looking globally, or should we be looking product by product at the marginal impacts of individual media changes? Should we be comparing the impact of the use of products, paper products, or do we need to include the full life cycle of all of the products we look at, including manufacture and disposal? What's included in the life cycle assessment if we do go down the life cycle assessment route? Are we looking only at carbon footprints, or do we need to look at all the other environmental and social impacts as well, such as those I listed earlier for paper? And if we go that route, do we know enough actually about all of those impacts for new technologies like digital tools? How can we handle the fact that paper versus digital is, the comparisons between them is a bit like comparing apples and oranges? There are various issues here. One of them is the kind of threshold effect. There are claims in various areas that up to a certain level, paper has less of an environmental impact, but beyond it, its impact is cumulative, and so beyond that threshold, digital becomes a better option. And there are, of course, big issues around the fact that if you replace paper with a digital application, that involves very often using tools that are becoming more and more and more multifunctional. So if you're comparing a book with a digital device that has many, many different functions, how do you make that comparison? So as I said, we can only scratch the surface of that, but rather than try and talk really broadly about a huge range of things, what we're doing is we're going to look at through the eyes of some experts who drill down into some of the complexity of this topic. The first of these is Michael Sturgis, who, like I said, works for Inventure, a pulp and paper expert, and he's been looking in particular at the issue of publishing. And then we'll look at a particular organizational study that has been done by Penguin Books, and that'll be introduced by Meredith Walsh. So I'll hand over now to Michael, who will give the next part of the seminar.
Okay. Hi everyone, good afternoon. I hope you can all hear me clearly. I'm going to pick up where Mandy left off really to try and give you some real life experiences of trying to understand what the footprint of digital publishing might be and how that might compare against traditional publishing techniques. specifically from the point of view of the magazine sector, but hopefully some of the learnings can be transferred to other sectors too, although we have to be careful in doing that. Sorry, I'm having trouble making the slides move forward this time. We never had this on the run through. It worked fine. Got it. Sorry for that. Okay, so what I'd like to do really is give you a bit of background to our carbon journey. One thing I'd like to stress right at the very beginning is that we don't have all the answers. You're not going to leave this seminar today and know everything that you need to know. There'll be unanswered questions for sure. And we've been on this carbon journey now for more than 10 years, and we still don't have all the answers to our questions. But we learn more and more every time we delve a little deeper. In the magazine sector, I started supporting them in 2001 when the industry decided it was time to understand what resources they were using and what wastes they were producing. So we produced something called a mass balance study. That served as a really valuable baseline for the industry for managing its resource use and helping understand where the inefficiencies were that could be improved. But in 2008, we really realised that there was a need to update that and move the focus towards carbon. So we produced a sector carbon footprint study. This in itself was hugely valuable, but what we also realised was within that sector footprint, the impact of any one individual title could vary hugely depending on the type of paper used, the pagination of the publication, its circulation, its method of distribution, whether it's a subscription magazine or a news trade magazine. All these have an influence on the footprint of any individual product within the sector. And publishers wanted to know what was the footprint of their own individual products, and therefore what should they be focusing on. So in 2009, we produced a Microsoft Excel-based carbon calculator. And for a number of years, we've been keeping that up to date in terms of the data that's contained within that. And it allows a publisher to look really from cradle to grave, looking from the point of view of pulp and paper manufacturing, printing, distribution, and finally end of life of the magazines. And it's really focused at the moment on traditional magazine publishing. But of course, in that same period, the industry is changing rapidly, and digital content and digital media is really becoming the dominant, in some cases the dominant platform, but certainly a very fast growing platform. So we're working at the moment to move the calculator from its Excel form to become an online tool, and most importantly, we're extending its scope to include the footprint of digital publications, however they might be accessed, whether they're accessed by a laptop, a tablet, or a smartphone. And as part of that, we're doing some specific case studies with the industry. And that's where we are today. But one of the key things that we had to really consider when we were making that development was, what do we include as part of our digital footprint? So we drilled down to see where are the potential sources of greenhouse gas emissions from digital publishing. We identified really 5 stages in our supply chain. First of all, there's content generation. So this is, if you like, the journalistic activity, going out, taking photo shoots, writing articles, generating the content that makes magazines interesting. The GHG emissions can come from a variety of sources, but mostly it's going to be associated with travel. Okay. Then there's the content conversion. Well, this is really the office-based process of converting that content into something that can be published. So I guess traditionally with magazines, this would be editorial, it would be typesetting, etc. there will be equivalent processes. They're going to be desk and office based, and that's going to give rise to GHG emissions. Then the next step, of course, is content storage. This, if you like, is our data centres. And we hear a lot about data centres. I'm going to make some comments about those later on. But the important thing here is that in terms of content storage, there are a number of content storage strategies that are emerging, and each of those will have a different footprint, and we need to understand more about those footprints. Then there's the last two stages, and this is where it starts to become fuzzy. Are they our footprint or are they somebody else's? But we felt content distribution, i.e. getting our content from our repositories to the end user, and the actual consumption of that, the use phase, should be part of our product life cycle. Even though as publishers we have limited or even no influence over those two steps. We can't influence how content is distributed over the internet or the 3G network or whatever it may be, and we can't really influence which devices users choose to use, how they use them, how long they read, etc. Nonetheless, we felt that they should be part of our life cycle, because without them we don't have a product. They're part of our distribution supply chain, if you like, and we felt that that made it a more comparable set of boundaries with traditional publishing. Now, with content distribution and use, I think we also have to be aware there's energy required to make those stages work, but there's also a footprint associated with the manufacture of the hardware that's necessary for that distribution and necessary for that use phase. And again, I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. Now, as a starting point for our work, what we did was actually to make some literature review of existing research, and also to perform our own case studies using the data that we could find to see what our knowledge gaps were. And I guess what I'd say from that experience is we would stress some words of caution. The first of these is really to understand that at this moment in time there are very few studies that have already been performed on the footprint of digital publishing and the technologies required for digital publishing. And actually, from the perspective of a magazine publisher, we found only one that was directly comparable, and actually that was a piece of work that I'd made several years ago, so we already felt was a little out of date. Now, we can learn from the studies that are made, but I think we have to be careful if we transfer results from one type of publication to another. The way magazines are produced is different to the way, say, catalogues, books and other materials are produced, distributed and consumed. So we have to be careful how we transfer the results from one study to another situation. A second word of caution is that in the studies that have been performed, often the data and assumptions that we find are either contradictory or they lack transparency, and sometimes both. And this makes it hard to build reliable models of the carbon footprint for digital publishing. The third word of caution, of course, is that boundaries and methodologies that are chosen are highly influential on the results that are achieved and the conclusions that you draw. So, for example, how do you deal with carbon in the forest if you're looking at traditional publishing? How do you allocate the impact of a device where it is multifunctional? Unfortunately, because there aren't many studies around, some studies lack rigour but may achieve quite significant influence in the debate. And a good example of this, and this is no particular criticism of their work, but a company called Cleantech made a study 3 or 4 years ago of the Amazon Kindle. It was based on a lot of conjecture and estimation. There was no data support from Amazon themselves, who they were not behind the study. That study, with a lot of, with hindsight, a lot of inaccuracies, has gained quite a lot of credibility and is commonly used on the internet and beyond to promote the benefits of digital publishing, when really there is too many uncertainties in that to really be presenting it in that way. The other 2 points to stress, I guess, are that the displacement relationship between e-publishing and traditional publishing is not clear. So I think we need to be very careful when we start to make comparisons between the two media. The truth is that they're complementary, and we don't see people moving away from traditional magazines, for example, to e-publishing. We see them using the two media, but in different ways. And another limitation for us was that there is only a certain body of data that's available on the carbon impact of reading devices, and as we'll see as we go on, these are quite a significant part of the overall footprint. I think at the moment we have data from Apple, who publish the footprint of most of their devices, but actually that lacks transparency, so you have to make quite a lot of assumptions in order to use that data. Nonetheless, you can still get some very valuable insights from the research that does exist and the data that can be applied. And these, for me, are the key points to take away, the positives. The good thing is that the data we have and the knowledge and insight is improving all the time. Now, that can quite significantly change results achieved and conclusions drawn, but we shouldn't see that as a bad thing. We should see that as a progression. I'll give you a good example. A lot of the studies in the marketplace at the moment that look at the environmental impact of digital media, and in particular anything that involves the transfer of data across the internet, rely heavily on work that was done a few years ago, a very good body of work by two American scientists called Taylor and Coomey. And they estimated, using a top-down approach, they estimated the energy required and therefore the carbon footprint of data distribution. Now recently, there's an organisation at the University of Bristol called Impact, who have been working with a bottom-up approach to the analysis and came up with quite surprisingly different results to Taylor and Coomey. So they had the resource and the time to drill down in a lot of detail into the assumptions that Taylor and Coomey had made and the raw data sets that they had relied on in their calculations. And they actually found that the Taylor and Coomey data was an overestimate of perhaps tenfold. So we've all been overestimating the data distribution part of the supply chain by a magnitude of 10, which means that actually the digital footprint is smaller than we first thought, which is good news, I guess. But, you know, data improves all the time, results change it to reflect that. A second important conclusion for me, something that we've always been surprised by, but we found that other people achieve the same results, is that data center impacts are, although a data center on its own, as a standalone facility, is very energy intensive and has a large corporate carbon footprint, and that needs to be very well managed from a point of view of energy efficiency. When you allocate that energy impact across all of the various functions that data center can deliver, then from a product point of view, the impact may be small compared to other stages in the product life cycle. A third conclusion would be that the carbon impact of the supporting distribution network should not be forgotten. A number of the studies that we've seen have compared digital and traditional products, particularly, for example, e-billing, and assumed that there is no impact associated with the distribution network, and that's just not appropriate. A further conclusion, and we'll see more of this from Meredith, but user devices are a very significant part of the digital footprint. Both the energy required to power the devices and the impact associated with manufacturing the devices in the first place. And that remains the case even if we apply complex allocation procedures to account for the fact that these are multifunctional devices. This is a large part of the footprint. And subsequently, what that means is that user behaviour has a significant influence on the overall footprint of digital content. So what publishers need to do is identify where they can make decisions that help the user to minimise that footprint. And that's some of the things that in the magazine sector we're trying to look at now. How do we encourage people to use content more efficiently? One last slide to summarise what we've found. This looks like quite a complex diagram, but actually it's quite a simple concept in a way. We have three different modes of delivering content shown on this graph. We have the footprint in grey of reading a printed magazine. That varies according to what paper we use, how many pages we have, etc. But it doesn't matter how long we read it for, it stays the same. Okay? Whereas with digital content, the footprint varies with reading time. And that means there could be a crossover point when sometimes digital content is more favourable, sometimes printed content is more favourable. So I think what we're really trying to say is we need to be very careful in promoting one media over another. There are a mix of solutions and they all have an appropriate role to play in the marketplace. What we need to do is understand the footprint of all of these media and seek to minimise it in all cases. Okay. So I'm now going to hand over to Meredith Walsh, who's going to talk about the experience at Penguin. Okay. So hopefully, Meredith, control should now be with you.
Thanks, Michael. Yep, I've got the controls now. Hi, everyone. Michael, that was really interesting. I think even though Penguin have actually come from a different approach to looking at paper and digital, we're actually coming to some very similar conclusions there. So I'm going to talk a bit today about how we in the production and purchasing department have explored paper and digital and what we know about it now. So why did Penguin want to calculate their CO2 footprint in the first place? I think it helps to know the background to this to understand our eventual conclusions and the information we managed to gain. Penguin are a well-known publisher of trade, monoprint and colour books. And as a publisher producing a large volume of paper products, we've been managing the environmental impact on biodiversity and land rights of our paper products via certification and other tools for many years now. But we were increasingly aware of climate change and the role of carbon creation from manufacturing within climate change, and we wanted to know how to manage our carbon impacts. And we felt that to do this, we needed more knowledge in this area. With the rise of digital products, we also wanted to understand those footprints, and so ultimately the goal was to know the product footprints of both our paper and digital products, and then to manage both of those. We also did this though with an understanding that there may be increased legislation in this area, and that gaining your product footprint for paper or digital can take a long time, and we wanted to begin as early as possible to be fully ready for this. We were one of several publishers in the UK who wanted to get to their product footprints, and so through the UK Publishers Association we created bookcarbon.com. This was a tool built for us by Inventure, and it calculates the carbon footprints for all our monoprint books printing in the UK, and it looks at that carbon footprint from cradle to grave. That's from the manufacturing of the paper through the manufacturing of the print product and all elements of distribution up to our warehouses. And we got some interesting information back from this, and we presented it back to the business. And I'm giving you here, you can see in the top diagram, an iPad, an e-reader, an e-book, a small paperback, and a large hardback. I put on the small hardback and the small paperback and the large hardback to demonstrate that there's a range of products that we produce, and they have a range of carbon footprints from their manufacturing and creation of content. But I've also put on here the iPad and the e-reader, because while our tool was originally created to create a paper footprint, and we knew that ultimately we wanted to get to a digital footprint as well, the moment we presented this information, because the digital products that we produce are increasing in market share, the business automatically said, oh, well, this is very interesting, and what would the footprint of a digital product be? We had come at this originally from the perspective of looking at the full carbon footprint of manufacturing. So we felt it was appropriate to go out there and find out what manufacturing information we could get for digital products as well. We could see what the content creation phase was, but devices also need to be created, so we wanted to see that manufacturing footprint. There isn't a large quantity of publicly available data at the moment, but Apple do put on all their carbon footprints for their products, and the iPad is given a manufacturing CO2 footprint of 115 kilos. This is an interesting diagram, partly because it shows that the range of values is so substantial, from the iPad at 115 CO2 kilos to the e-book creation at 0.2 kilo and the small paperback at 0.27. The second diagram I wanted to put in here to show that while initially we looked at the manufacturing footprint, you can also see from Apple's data they've put in an estimate for the full usage of the consumer on that iPad, and that adds another 55 kilos. But that's across the full life of the iPad, and it will include many, many functions. So what were we able to gain from this information? Well, I'm going to think about this both in terms of the book production and then of the digital supply chain. And from book production, we can see that actually the main CO2 impacts when we print a book are lying for us mostly in the paper. And we can see that over a certain number of pages, in somewhere in the region of about 200 pages, we know that paper becomes the most significant element by volume, and also that we can manage this impact. One of the things that the carbon footprint tool incorporated was that we would look at a range of papers that we might potentially be using. And by looking at the different carbon footprints of each of these papers and knowing a little bit about the mills and how the papers were produced, we gained valuable insights into what is actually affecting the carbon footprints of paper manufacturing. And what we discovered that where a mill is integrated, which means that they're taking in full logs and grinding them down into pulp, that process creates energy in itself, which can be used further down the line in the manufacturing process. And also mills which were using renewable energy sources, both of these types of mills were able to significantly reduce the carbon impact effect of their manufacturing. So it's been really valuable to us creating the carbon footprint tool, and of itself we feel that actually it's valuable to have a calculator to show you that detailed level of information, because from this you understand where your key carbon impacts are and also where you can then manage them. We could also see that within the GHG protocol scopes created by the WRI, we have lowered our impact. So not only do we understand what our scope 1 and 2, our direct impacts are, but those impacts in scope 3, which we are less able to influence, we can nevertheless make purchasing choices which will lower the impacts there as well. But many questions were raised for us by this process as well. the more we look at it, the more we find that knowledge promotes insights, which enables us to manage our environmental impacts. And there are substantial questions which the information we've seen so far means that we'd like to answer. First of these, we'd like to have more information on how our customers use devices. How long do they read for? Do they read to finish a book, to finish an article? Do they perhaps have a screen tolerance time? They may not choose to read a full book. They might decide they have an hour available to them. They could be reading a book, an article, or perhaps actually doing their weekly shopping online. Also, what kind of products are our customers using on devices? Will they use or read a mass market paperback in the same way that they would read a children's book? Does a history book translate as well to a digital product as that mass market paperback? So these are questions which we don't have the answers to, but we feel that they could potentially helping us in thinking about how we might then design products which could be potentially low in storage and perhaps low in use as well when it came to using them on a device. Another really key question for us though was, what kind of methodology should we use to compare single function devices and products to multi-function devices? When I refer to single function, I'm thinking both of our paper books, but also of something like a Kindle on which you'll be solely reading books or something of that ilk. Whereas the multifunctional devices, they're used for many different apps. So it could be somebody's shopping, it could be a map. There are all sorts of different ways they're going to get used. And without having that methodology in place, though we're seeing very small footprints for books versus much more substantial footprints for iPads in terms of carbon, what we're not seeing is the number of different ways in which that tablet will actually be used. And that's going to be key to actually getting to a sensible comparison. Additionally, in this mapping of the environmental impacts, for digital we've actually started at carbon, whereas carbon is further towards the end point for our paper products. We know quite a bit about the effects which manufacturing of paper has on forests, and we know how to manage those impacts via things like certification. There are also some very interesting tools around. There's one from the Environmental Paper Network where you can, if you put in the amount of paper you're going to use, you can see an estimate for the volume of trees that would be required to create that paper. There isn't the equivalent kind of information available at the moment for the digital supply chain, and the extraction of minerals has in itself been directly linked to deforestation as a driver of deforestation. So I think to really understand the environmental impacts, there's quite a lot that needs to be found out about the materials within the digital supply chain. Another really key question for us is, as our product base changes, how should our communication with customers change? We're communicating with our customers directly all the time. We have information on large numbers of our books about the forestry issues involved and stating that the paper is FSC or otherwise certified. We also have other means of communication, and how best should we be utilising those to talk to our customers about managing digital footprints. But we have learned about digital production as well. We have gained really valuable insights from this very basic comparison. The first one is that we are able to measure some of our digital footprint right from now, which is that we understand what the digital footprint of our content generation is, because actually digital products and paper products are generated from exactly the same place. And though there is limited publicly available data on the CO2 footprint of manufacturing reading devices, we do know that there's some available, and it has nevertheless been useful in developing our understanding of paper and digitally comparatively. The biggest question for us, or biggest insight perhaps, is that under those GHG protocol scopes created by WRI, we are moving our products into the digital space, and this is lowering, really importantly, our carbon and forest impacts, and we're very pleased about that. But at the same time, the scope, which is very practical and it's designed to enable to think about where they can influence their supply chain, but the scope doesn't account for the fact that actually the product impact may be moving from one supply chain, one area of media into another. So I think that's work that still needs to be done so that there can be full transparency and full management of those impacts. And another positive thing that we've established is actually that through digital media in itself, we have lots of different ways that we can engage with our customers, via social media, via our website, and we do actually have really significant opportunities for engaging with them and potentially changing customer behaviour and influencing it. So we can talk to them about opportunities to recycle books, opportunities to recycle devices, about ways that devices can be repaired to increase their longevity, and also about the reusing of books. So I think there are really positive things which have come out of this study already. Alongside the questions, we are aware that actually fundamentally we've in one area started to lower our carbon and forest impacts, which is hugely pleasing. We're also seeing that actually potentially data could get to the stage where digital is supporting that lowering of carbon and other environmental impacts, as long as we gain those insights and start to use it in the most appropriate fashion. Thank you very much for listening. I'm going to hand you back now to Mandy, and she will talk to you a little bit about additional resources to go alongside this seminar.
Thanks very much, Meredith and Michael. And thank you all very much for listening. If you'd like to follow up, we have some signposts to some of the resources that got mentioned up on our website, and the link is there. And there's also a free environmental paper calculator that you can use to look at least at the environmental footprint of the paper part of these comparisons, which is managed by our sister network in North America. But now, if any of you have questions, then I'm sure we'd be really interested to hear what you have to say, and let the debate go on. If you'd like to ask a question, if you stick a message in the chat box at the bottom, and we can unmute you and let you ask.
Hello, Mandy. I've got a question, excuse me, perhaps relevant to universities and colleges. We talked about data centers and obviously the information about high energy use there. And do any of the three of you have any idea how we can engage people perhaps who think of themselves outside of paper within that calculation and within that thinking of trying to reduce the overall carbon footprint?
Hi, sorry, I missed your name.
Ian Boyd, EAUC.
Okay. Hi, Ian. Yeah, sorry, it's Michael Sturgis here. I think that's a really good question. It's particularly difficult sometimes with the new media community to engage them in the environmental issues, and it's not because they're not interested. Often what we find is that they're in an industry that at the moment, the pace of change is so fast that they're running to keep up with their competitors in terms of the service offerings that they provide, in terms of the technology that they have. And they simply don't have time to stop and take a breath and look around and think about how they might do things more efficiently. I think what's gradually starting to happen, though, is the realisation that energy costs money, data centres, technology, distribution, whatever it may be, uses quite a lot of energy, even though per unit of service it's quite efficient. Overall, it's a big cost to the sector. So I think that's how we're gradually seeing people start to become more engaged. It's a combination of the cost and also, I think, the external pressure that we've seen on a lot of organisations, from government, from consumers, to take some action. Yeah. I don't know if any of the other speakers would like to add anything else.
I've thought a little bit about this from a buyer's perspective, and I think that Michael's absolutely right that costs can play a very significant part in helping people think about the fact they might want to make changes to their data storage, and suggesting that there are simple ways to get around the time issues of approaching this can really help, like moving to cloud storage facilities, which is a much more efficient way to store data than a company necessarily having its own servers. So then, in addition to that, perhaps there are questions which can be asked. So if you want somebody who can supply the service, but they're using renewable energies, is this a way which they're managing to bring down their energy bill and then reduce costs overall? So I think there are questions in that area, but you do need sometimes those quite big, simple solutions which people can implement easily, because there is a lot going on in that sphere at the moment.
Are there any other questions?
Mandy, it's Michael here again. I guess I have a question for Meredith, if there are no others at the moment I'd like to pose.
Yeah, go for it.
Just looking at your last slides there, you said that there were a lot of questions that remained unanswered, Meredith, and we find exactly the same. You know, there's lots more that we want to learn. Do you at the moment have any plan going forward as to how you will address those, or is that something that you're thinking about now?
It's something that we're thinking about at present. I think there's a lot of work that could perhaps be done on understanding what kind of digital products that we've sold at the moment, what there's an interest in, but we still need, I think, some external analysis to understand, once you've sold a product, how is it used?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, well, if there are no other questions, I'd like to once again thank very much Michael and Meredith, and also Ian for hosting us at the AUC, and thanks to all the rest of you for listening in and taking part in this webinar. And as soon as the recording is up online, then I'll let everybody know who's involved in our paper efficiency project, and hopefully I can get also contact details from the webinar hosts for those of you who are not directly involved in our project. So yeah, thanks to everybody very much for taking part.
Thank you very much for attending, and that's the end of the webinar today.